My name is Cassidy, 33 years old, and a mergers and acquisitions expert who specializes in hostile corporate takeovers. On my wedding day, as I stood in a custom silk gown at a $2 million Hamptons estate, my husband-to-be looked at me and smiled, not with love, but with pure malice. Moments later, the heavy oak doors swung open, and my adopted stepsister marched down the aisle pushing a twin stroller. He kissed her proudly, held up the newborns, and announced to our 400 elite guests that he could not live without the mother of his children. He thought he had completely destroyed me and secured his billionaire fortune. He had no idea I had already signed the paperwork that would burn his entire empire to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe the best revenge is legally ruining the people who tried to play you. The ocean breeze sweeping off the Atlantic was supposed to make my wedding day picture perfect. The sprawling estate we rented overlooked a pristine private beach, costing a fortune just to secure for the weekend. Hundreds of white orchids dripped from imported crystal chandeliers. 400 guests from New York's top financial and social circles sat in gilded chairs, waiting for me to say I do, to Declan Price. Declan was 35 years old, the impossibly handsome and universally arrogant heir to the Price Holdings conglomerate. With his slicked-back dark hair and tailored designer tuxedo, he looked exactly like the billionaire playboy the media constantly portrayed him to be. I stood across from him at the altar, holding a heavy bouquet of rare white roses, maintaining my absolute best professional smile. Everyone in our social circle believed this was the ultimate power coupling. A strategic union of top-tier investment strategy and old legacy wealth. My stepmother sat in the front row wearing a dress entirely too white and too flashy for a wedding that was not hers. She was grinning, practically vibrating with nervous energy. She had spent the last 2 decades treating me like an unwanted financial burden, constantly reminding me that I was lucky she and my father even allowed me to live in their house after my biological mother passed away. Her only biological daughter, my stepsister Brianna, was conspicuously absent from the bridal party. Brianna was 28 years old and had spent her entire life perfecting the art of playing the fragile victim while systematically stealing everything I ever worked for. If I got a lead role in the school play, Brianna would cry until my father forced me to step down so she could take it. If I brought home a boy I liked, Brianna would spin a web of lies to make him think I was cheating, just so she could swoop in and comfort him. I should have known my lavish wedding day would be her ultimate target. The priest cleared his throat, his voice echoing across the manicured lawn through the microphone. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The timing was so painfully dramatic I almost rolled my eyes. Right on cue, the massive oak doors at the back of the venue swung open with a heavy thud. Every single head in the audience turned. There stood Brianna wearing a skin-tight blush pink dress, pushing a massive luxury twin stroller down the center aisle. Whispers erupted immediately among the CEOs, socialites, and celebrities seated in the rows. I looked at Declan, expecting to see shock, confusion, or anger on his face. Instead, I saw a smug, triumphant grin spreading across his lips. He did not look at the doors. He looked right at me, relishing the moment he thought he was breaking my heart and humiliating me in public. He stepped away from the altar, leaving me standing alone in front of the priest. The elite guests gasped in unison as Declan walked halfway down the aisle to meet Brianna. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her in for a deep, passionate kiss right in front of my own wedding guests. My stepmother actually clapped her hands together in delight from the front row, not even trying to hide her joy at my public destruction. Declan reached into the stroller and lifted 2 tiny newborns, holding them up like grand trophies. He turned to face the crowd, soaking in the collective shock, then looked directly into my eyes with absolute contempt. "I am sorry, Cassidy," he announced, his voice loud and clear enough for the very back row to hear. "But I cannot live without the mother of my children. We are done." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. 400 of New York's wealthiest power brokers, venture capitalists, and socialites sat paralyzed in their gilded chairs. The only sound was the gentle crashing of the Atlantic waves against the shoreline. Then, right on cue, Brianna launched into her carefully rehearsed performance. She handed one of the swaddled infants to Declan and stepped forward, her face twisting into an expression of profound manufactured agony. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth, forcing her eyes to well up with fake tears. "You always stole the spotlight from me growing up, Cassidy," she cried out, ensuring her voice carried across the manicured lawn. "You took every opportunity, every ounce of praise, and every bit of attention. I let you have it all because I wanted to be a good sister. But I could not let you take my baby's father. I just could not do it." It was a masterful display of toxic manipulation, one I had witnessed 1,000 times before. This was Brianna's signature move. She framed her malicious theft as an act of maternal desperation and painted my lifetime of hard-earned achievements as greedy spotlight stealing. She had used that exact same trembling voice when she ruined my high school graduation by faking a panic attack, and again when she intentionally sabotaged my first major job interview by hiding my portfolio. She always played the fragile, bullied victim, twisting reality, until everyone rushed to comfort her, while painting me as the cold, calculating villain. Right on cue, my stepmother shot up from her front row seat. She did not look shocked or appalled by the destruction of my wedding. Instead, she beamed with pride. "Oh, my brave girl," my stepmother shouted, clapping her hands together. She rushed out of her seat and threw her arms around Brianna and Declan, cooing over the newborns. "Thank God you finally stood up for yourself and your family." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. I could see the whispers spreading like wildfire among the hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons in the audience. Declan stood tall, puffing out his chest, completely reveling in his role as the wealthy savior who had chosen true love over a corporate marriage. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and arrogant triumph, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He expected me to scream. He expected me to throw my heavy bouquet of white roses at his head. He expected me to fall to my knees, sobbing in humiliation, while the hired photographers captured my absolute ruin for the society pages. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or lose my composure for even a fraction of a second. In my line of work, navigating high-stakes mergers and acquisitions, you learn very quickly that emotion is a liability. You learn that when an opponent thinks they have cornered you, they become careless. They expose their weaknesses. Declan and Brianna thought they were starring in a romantic soap opera, where the rich heir heroically chooses the sweet downtrodden stepsister over the wicked corporate shark. They had no idea they had just walked blindfolded into a financial slaughterhouse. Instead of breaking down, I simply looked at the three of them celebrating on my altar, and I smirked. It was not a defensive smile or a mask for underlying pain. It was a genuine, terrifying smirk of pure satisfaction. I felt a rush of adrenaline, the exact same thrill I get right before closing a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover. Declan caught my expression. His victorious grin faltered slightly. His eyebrows furrowed as he tried to process why the woman he had just publicly humiliated was looking at him like he was a lamb walking into a slaughter. He shifted his weight suddenly, looking uncomfortable in his tailored tuxedo. I did not say a word to him. Instead, I turned my attention away from the circus act in front of me and looked toward the first row on my side of the aisle. My executive assistant, a fiercely intelligent woman who had been helping me quietly arrange this trap for the past 6 weeks, was already standing. She wore a sharp charcoal pantsuit and a completely neutral expression. When I caught her eye, she gave me a single crisp nod. She stepped into the center aisle, her heels clicking softly against the white runner, and walked directly up the steps of the altar. Without saying a word to Declan or Brianna, she handed me a sleek, heavy red folder. I took the folder, feeling the weight of its contents in my hands. The smooth leather exterior felt cool against my palms. Inside were the documents that would not just end this wedding, but fundamentally dismantle Declan's entire existence. I ran my fingers over the edge of the folder, my smirk widening into a cold, calculated smile as I prepared to deliver the final blow. I flipped open the heavy red cover. Inside sat a pristine stack of legal documents printed on thick, watermarked paper. This was not a hastily written reaction to a broken heart. This was a meticulously crafted annulment and divorce filing drafted weeks ago by the most ruthless corporate litigators in Manhattan. The paperwork specifically cited gross marital fraud, breach of contract, and public humiliation. I had known about his little secret for over a month. You do not survive in the world of high-stakes venture capital by being blind to the liabilities in your own portfolio. Declan was a liability. I just needed him to publicly admit his breach of contract in front of 400 witnesses to trigger the trap. I reached into the inner pocket of the folder and pulled out a vintage fountain pen filled with bright crimson ink. My biological father, a weak man who always let my stepmother walk all over him, watched from the second row with his mouth hanging open. He looked terrified of the scandal. My stepmother had stopped cheering, her eyes darting between the red folder and my dangerously calm expression. I did not hesitate. I flattened the documents against the smooth marble surface of the altar. With quick, fluid strokes, I signed my name in bleeding red ink on the signature line. The scratching sound of the pen nib against the thick paper echoed through the dead silent venue. I capped the pen, securing it with a sharp click. I picked up the thick stack of freshly signed legal filings. I stepped down from the altar, closing the distance between Declan and myself. Brianna instinctively clutched the twin stroller, her fake tears drying up as she realized I was not playing my assigned role of the devastated bride. I did not look at her or the children. My eyes remained locked on Declan. He puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his arrogant billionaire posture, but I saw the slight tremor in his jaw. I lifted the heavy packet of documents and slammed it directly against his chest. Instinctively, his arms flew up to catch the papers before they scattered across the grass. "Good thing I came prepared," I stated coldly, my voice slicing through the salty ocean breeze. "Congratulations on putting your own head in the noose, Declan." For a fraction of a second, genuine confusion flashed across his perfectly tanned face. He looked down at the bold red ink drying on the legal pages, reading the bold headers declaring an immediate annulment. Then the arrogance returned. He scoffed, throwing his head back and letting out a loud, theatrical laugh. He actually thought this was a desperate attempt to save face. He genuinely believed I was acting out of pure hysterical emotion. "Are you serious right now?" Declan mocked, waving the annulment papers in the air for the crowd to see. "You think a piece of paper is going to save your pride, Cassidy? You think handing me divorce papers makes you look like a winner? I just dumped you at the altar. I just chose a real woman over a corporate robot." Brianna leaned her head against his shoulder, playing her part perfectly. "Please, Cassidy," she whimpered, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. Just walk away with whatever dignity you have left. Declan loves me. You throwing a tantrum and shoving paperwork at him will not change the fact that we are a family now." "A tantrum." I repeated, my tone entirely devoid of anger. "You think this is a tantrum?" "It is pathetic, is what it is," my stepmother shouted from the front row, completely abandoning any pretense of high society manners. "You always have to have the last word. You cannot just accept that a man finally saw through your cold, bossy exterior and chose someone warm and loving. Take your little red folder and leave." Declan smirked, tossing the documents back onto the marble altar. He adjusted his expensive lapels and looked down his nose at me. "You heard them, Cassidy. It is over. You can try to play the tough investment banker all you want, but everyone here knows you are just a bitter, rejected woman trying to claw back some control. My family has more money than God. We have a legacy. You are just a guest who overstayed her welcome. These papers mean nothing to me." I let him finish his little speech. I let him bask in his imaginary victory while the ocean wind rustled through the white orchids above us. He had no idea what he had just signed away by making that public confession. He had no idea that the noose was already tightening securely around his neck. Before Declan could take another breath to gloat, slow, deliberate clapping echoed from the second row. The rhythmic sound cut through the whispers of the elite crowd. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the center aisle. It was Andre, the husband to Felicity Price, and brother-in-law to Declan. At 34 years old, Andre was a brilliant corporate attorney, a formidable black man who had fought his way to the top of the legal food chain. He was also the only person in the entire Price family who commanded my respect. He saw right through their generational arrogance and recognized me as a fellow shark. Andre adjusted his navy suit jacket and walked up the marble steps. He did not look at Brianna or the crying infants in the stroller. He walked straight past my stepmother, ignoring her confused glare, and approached the priest. Without asking permission, Andre grasped the microphone from the trembling clergyman. The feedback whined for a split second before settling into a sharp, clear tone that commanded the attention of every billionaire socialite and journalist sitting in the audience. Declan frowned, his smug demeanor faltering. He glared at the powerful lawyer. "What are you doing up here, Andre? Go sit back down with Felicity. This is family business. You do not belong on this stage." Andre smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile that I had seen him use in courtrooms right before destroying opposing counsel. "I am up here acting in my official capacity as corporate counsel for Price Holdings," Andre stated, his deep voice projecting flawlessly across the sprawling beachfront estate. "And as your attorney, Declan, it is my professional duty to inform you that you have just made the single most catastrophic financial mistake of your miserable life." My stepmother gasped. Brianna clutched Declan tightly, her fake victim persona slipping as genuine panic set in. Declan let out a nervous scoff. "What are you talking about? I am dumping a woman who only cares about money for my real family." "You are choosing bankruptcy," Andre corrected smoothly. He turned to face the audience, making sure every financial reporter in the back row could hear him clearly. Less than 24 hours ago, Declan Price signed an ironclad prenuptial agreement. It was a binding contract drafted by my firm, thoroughly reviewed and legally executed. Within that contract sat a highly specific, non-negotiable morality clause. Murmurs erupted across the venue. Wall Street executives leaned forward. They understood the language of contracts far better than romance. Andre turned back to Declan, pointing a finger directly at his chest. The morality clause explicitly stated that any public embarrassment, admitted infidelity, or revelation of illegitimate heirs brought forward by either party would result in an immediate default of the marriage contract. The penalty is not a simple divorce settlement. It triggers an automatic forfeiture of specific corporate protections that were keeping your family empire afloat. Declan's face went completely slack. The fake tan seemed to drain from his cheeks. Brianna looked frantically between her sister and Declan, completely lost in the legal jargon, but intelligent enough to know that things were going terribly wrong. "You brought your mistress to your own wedding," Andre continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "You paraded illegitimate heirs in front of 400 high-profile witnesses, including members of the press. You proudly admitted to infidelity on a live microphone. You did not just break your vows, Declan. You breached a multi-million-dollar corporate contract in the most spectacular, legally binding way possible." My stepmother sank back into her chair, the color leaving her face. She had spent her whole life chasing wealth, and now she watched her daughter, billionaire, ticket catch fire. Declan stepped forward, his fists clenched, panic replacing his arrogance. "You cannot do this!" Declan shouted, his voice cracking. "My father owns the firm. My father owns everything. You work for us. I am the heir to Price Holdings." Andre shook his head slowly, handing the microphone back to the terrified priest. "You were the heir, Declan. But by activating that morality clause and forcing Cassidy to sign those annulment papers, you just handed her the keys to the kingdom." I stood perfectly still, watching reality crash over them. The cool ocean breeze felt magnificent. I let my brilliant ally deliver the fatal blow, while the men who thought they ruled the world realized they had just been conquered. Declan stared at me, searching for a way out. There was absolutely none. I had not shed a tear, nor raised my voice. I simply allowed the legal framework I built to snap shut around him. Declan finally realized he had surrendered his entire legacy to a woman who would never ever show him any mercy. I held Declan's terrified gaze for a long, silent moment. I wanted to sear this exact image into my memory. The powerful heir to the Price Holdings empire, standing in his bespoke tuxedo, sweating under the afternoon sun, as the reality of his blunder washed over him. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single tear. I did not scream, and I certainly did not break down. I simply raised my left hand, letting the bright afternoon sunlight catch the sharp edges of the 5-carat diamond engagement ring he had given me 6 months ago. The heavy platinum band slid easily off my finger. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the cold weight of a promise that was never meant to be kept. Declan watched my hand carefully, his breathing shallow and rapid. Brianna stood frozen beside him, clutching the stroller handles so tightly her knuckles were white. She expected a massive fight. She expected me to demand answers, to throw myself at her feet and beg for an explanation. Instead, I turned my back on both of them without uttering another syllable. I descended the marble steps of the altar, my custom silk gown gliding smoothly over the polished stone. I walked toward the center aisle, stopping right next to the front row. A wealthy venture capitalist, a man who had known the Price family for decades, sat paralyzed in his gilded chair. He was clutching a crystal flute filled with expensive vintage champagne. I reached out and suspended my hand directly over his glass. I opened my fingers. The massive diamond ring plummeted, landing in the golden liquid with a sharp, heavy clink. Champagne splashed over the rim, staining the crisp white tablecloth nearby. The man stared up at me in shock. I gave him a polite, brief nod and continued my walk. My posture remained perfectly straight. I kept my chin high and my shoulders pulled back, projecting nothing but absolute dominance. As I strode down the long white runner, the whispers of 400 elite guests rose to a deafening roar. They parted away from me as if my sheer confidence was a physical force. I could hear the hushed gasps and the frantic typing on smartphones as Wall Street insiders immediately began texting their corporate brokers. They smelled blood in the water. They just did not realize yet exactly whose blood it was. Behind me, I could hear Brianna finally finding her fragile voice again. She wrapped her arms tightly around Declan, pressing her face against his chest. I heard her loudly whisper that everything was going to be fine. She told him that they still had his father, his massive trust fund, and his billionaire legacy. She cooed that my grand exit was just a desperate act of a bitter woman. Declan loudly agreed, his voice echoing across the green lawn. He puffed his chest out, desperately trying to project strength and authority. He actually shouted to the stunned crowd that the luxurious reception was still on, fully believing he had just won the ultimate victory. They stood at the altar looking utterly foolish, completely convinced they had secured the endless Price family fortune. I reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the estate and pushed them open. The moment I stepped outside the venue, sheer chaos erupted. The paparazzi had been tipped off about the corporate drama. Dozens of photographers crowded the iron gates, their cameras firing continuously like bright strobe lights. Reporters shouted my name loudly, demanding a statement about the scandalous wedding disaster. I did not hide my face. I did not duck behind my hands or ask for privacy. I looked directly into the flashing lenses and delivered a sharp, victorious smile. The flashing lights illuminated the satisfaction on my face. I knew these images would be splashed across every financial blog and gossip magazine by tomorrow morning. The headline would paint me as an ice queen who walked away from a billionaire, but the truth was far more lucrative. I was walking away to take over his empire. I settled back against the leather headrest, feeling the deep vibration of the engine. I watched the sprawling estate shrink rapidly in the rearview mirror. My personal driver was already waiting beside a sleek black SUV, holding the rear door open. I slid into the soft leather seat, smoothing out the skirt of my wedding gown with practiced ease. Andre stepped out of the venue moments later, giving me a knowing salute before walking to his own car. I told my driver to pull away immediately, leaving the entire media circus and the delusional couple far behind me. While my driver navigated the coastal highway, leaving the media circus far behind me, a very different scene was unfolding at the main Price family estate. Declan had immediately whisked his new instant family away from the disastrous reception venue and straight to his father's primary residence. The sprawling mansion in Southampton was a monument to old money, featuring vaulted ceilings, imported Italian marble floors, and priceless Renaissance artwork lining the corridors. It was an intimidating fortress of wealth, and for my stepmother and stepsister, it represented the ultimate jackpot. As soon as the heavy front doors closed behind them, the performance immediately ended. Brianna practically shoved the luxury twin stroller toward an incredibly confused head housekeeper, demanding that someone take the children to the nursery so she could finally celebrate in peace. She did not even ask if the babies needed feeding or changing. They had served their purpose as the ultimate props for her dramatic entrance, and now she was ready to reap her reward. My stepmother trailed right behind them, her heels clicking loudly on the marble. She was already spinning in circles, examining the grand foyer with the hungry eyes of a vulture who had just found a fresh carcass. "This space is entirely too dark," Declan, she declared, waving her hand dismissively at a 16th century tapestry hanging on the western wall. "We need to tear down these dreary velvet drapes immediately. I am thinking Venetian silk, something bright and modern for the guest wing. After all, Brianna and I will need plenty of natural light when we host our afternoon charity galas. We cannot have the elite women of New York thinking we live in a haunted museum." Brianna nodded enthusiastically, linking her arm tightly through Declan's. "Mom is right, babe. We are going to breathe some fresh life into this dusty old house. It is our era now. I was thinking we could knock down that dividing wall to expand the master suite." Declan grinned, completely oblivious to the fact that these two women were already carving up his family legacy like a roast turkey. He walked straight to the custom mahogany bar, bypassing the standard liquor, to grab a bottle of vintage champagne that belonged exclusively to his father. He popped the cork with a loud celebratory crack, letting the expensive foam spill carelessly over the polished wood surface. To the new era, Declan toasted, pouring the champagne into 3 crystal flutes. He handed them out, his chest puffed out with sheer arrogance. I have to admit, seeing the look on Cassidy's face when she realized she lost was the greatest moment of my entire life. She always thought she was so untouchable, sitting in her corporate boardrooms trying to control my every move. Well, I finally put the Ice Queen exactly where she belongs, at the absolute bottom. My stepmother eagerly clinked her glass against his, taking a greedy sip. "You were magnificent, Declan. Truly. The way you stood up for my daughter was exactly what a real man does. Cassidy has always been a bitter, calculating machine. She thought she could trap you with a marriage certificate, but you completely outsmarted her." Declan took a large gulp of the champagne, practically choking on his own inflated ego. "She thought throwing those annulment papers at me was some sort of power move. It was pathetic. She literally did my lawyers a massive favor. By handing me an annulment on a silver platter, she completely forfeited any right to claim alimony or a divorce settlement. I walked away completely free, and I kept every single cent of the Price family fortune." Brianna leaned against the bar, surveying the massive estate. She was already picturing her name on the deed. "We should start planning our actual wedding," she cooed, tracing a finger down Declan's chest. "Something bigger, something global. The media is going to love our love story, Declan. The billionaire who gave up a sterile, loveless corporate arrangement to follow his heart and build a real family. We are going to be America's favorite couple." They stood there in the grand foyer of a house they did not own, drinking champagne they did not buy, celebrating a victory they had not actually won. My stepmother was already dialing her interior designer on her cell phone, loudly demanding immediate fabric samples for a house she had absolutely zero legal right to modify. Declan was pacing the room, laughing about how he had completely blindsided my brilliant legal team. He genuinely believed that my lack of a dramatic, tearful reaction was just a coping mechanism for profound humiliation. He was entirely convinced that he was the smartest man in the Hamptons. They were drowning in their own delusions of grandeur, completely insulated by their boundless greed, unaware that the true owner of the estate was about to bring their world crashing down. The heavy mahogany front doors of the Southampton estate burst open with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls. The loud crash echoed through the grand foyer, instantly silencing the celebratory laughter. Declan froze with his champagne glass suspended halfway to his mouth. Brianna jumped instinctively, grabbing the handles of the twin stroller. My stepmother gasped, dropping her fabric swatches onto the imported marble floor. Richard Price stood in the doorway. He was a man who had built a ruthless billionaire empire from the ground up, a patriarch who usually moved with calculated, terrifying grace. But right now, he looked entirely unhinged. His tailored suit jacket was wrinkled. His tie was pulled loose around his neck. His chest heaved as he dragged in ragged breaths. He did not look like a triumphant father ready to welcome his new grandchildren. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world catch fire. Declan quickly recovered his arrogant posture, flashing a wide smile at his father. He took a confident step forward, raising his crystal flute in the air. "Dad, you missed the greatest moment of the decade," Declan cheered loudly. "I finally got rid of the corporate ball and chain. Cassidy is gone." I stood up to her in front of everyone and claimed my real family. "Come over here and meet your actual heirs." Brianna immediately pushed the luxury stroller forward, positioning herself directly in Richard's line of sight. She flashed her most sweet, innocent smile, clearly expecting the billionaire patriarch to melt at the sight of the two newborn boys. She even reached down to pick one of them up, preparing to hand the child over to his wealthy grandfather. Richard did not even glance at the children. He did not acknowledge Brianna or my stepmother, who was standing eagerly nearby, waiting for an introduction. His eyes darted wildly around the grand foyer until they locked onto a specific object resting on the entryway console table. It was the heavy red folder, the exact same folder I had slammed against Declan's chest at the altar. Declan had carelessly tossed it onto the table when they walked into the house, completely dismissing the legal documents inside as the frantic scribblings of a bitter former bride. Richard lunged forward. He shoved past his son so forcefully that Declan stumbled backwards, spilling expensive vintage champagne down the front of his tuxedo shirt. Brianna let out a sharp gasp, pulling the stroller away from the chaotic movement. Richard ignored all of them. He reached the console table and snatched the red folder with trembling hands. "What is your problem, Dad?" Declan shouted, trying to brush the sticky alcohol off his jacket. "It is just some stupid annulment paperwork she threw at me. She signed it right on the altar because she wanted to make a dramatic exit. My lawyers will handle the basic divorce filings on Monday. We have nothing to worry about. We won." Richard did not answer. He flipped the heavy red cover open. His eyes scanned the thick watermarked paper. He stared at the bright crimson ink where I had signed my name. As his eyes moved down the page, reading the specific legal statutes and corporate clauses I had explicitly activated, the remaining color completely drained from his face. He turned a sickening shade of ash white. The intimidating, ruthless patriarch of the Price family began to violently shake. The expensive legal papers rattled audibly in his hands. His breathing became incredibly shallow. He was reading the exact section detailing the morality clause, the specific breach of contract parameters, and the immediate forfeiture of corporate protections. He understood the language of hostile takeovers perfectly. He knew exactly what my signature meant. Richard staggered backward, his legs struggling to support his weight. He bumped into the console table, knocking over an ancient porcelain vase. The vase shattered into 1,000 pieces across the marble floor, but Richard did not flinch at the destruction. He just kept staring at the red ink on the annulment filing. Declan finally sensed that something was deeply wrong. He set his empty champagne glass down and cautiously approached his father. "Dad, you are acting crazy," Declan said, his voice losing its confident edge. "It is just a standard annulment. She is walking away with nothing. I made sure of it. I publicly shamed her and she retreated. We still have the company. We still have the legacy." Richard lifted his heavy, trembling head. His eyes were deeply bloodshot and filled with absolute terror. He looked at his arrogant son, not with pride, but with disgust and horror that could shatter glass. The heavy silence in the grand foyer was suffocating. Brianna and my stepmother stood perfectly still, too afraid to even breathe. Richard moved with terrifying speed that completely betrayed his age. He dropped the heavy red folder, letting the crisp legal pages scatter across the imported marble floor. He lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and his son in 2 massive strides. Before Declan could even raise his hands to defend himself, Richard grabbed him by the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo. With a surge of furious energy, the patriarch slammed his son backward into the expensive silk wallpaper. The impact shook the grand foyer, rattling the framed Renaissance artwork hanging nearby. Declan gasped for air, his eyes wide with genuine shock, as his father's fists twisted the expensive fabric of his shirt. He grabbed his father's wrists, trying to pry himself loose. Richard leaned in close, his face mere inches from Declan. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a chilling, unadulterated horror that froze the air in the room. "She didn't tell you?" Richard asked, his voice trembling with terror. Declan stammers, his confident billionaire persona completely shattering. "Tell me what—" "That she is mad." "Dad, let go of me right now. You are losing your mind over a woman who just threw a massive temper tantrum." Richard's grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. He shook his grown son violently against the wall. "A temper tantrum," Richard screamed, the sound tearing through the mansion and echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "Cassidy is not just some investment banker you picked up at a charity gala. She is the managing director of the most ruthless mergers and acquisitions firm on Wall Street. Her firm holds 80% of our conglomerate's toxic debt." Declan's face went completely blank. His arrogant smile vanished, replaced by utter confusion. "What debt? What are you talking about?" "We are Price Holdings. We are worth billions. We own half this city." "We are worth nothing," Richard roared, spitting the words directly into his son's face. "We have been bleeding capital for 5 years. We have been surviving entirely on leveraged loans, empty reputation, and smoke and mirrors. We were drowning in the deep end, and her firm quietly bought up every single one of our defaulted loans. They own us, Declan. They own this house. They own your cars. This marriage was not a romance, you arrogant fool. It was a corporate merger to save us from total bankruptcy." Brianna let out a strangled gasp. She gripped the handles of the luxury twin stroller, her knuckles turning bone white. My stepmother took a heavy step backward, her jaw dropping open, as the fantasy of unlimited wealth began to evaporate right before her very eyes. Declan shook his head frantically, desperately trying to reject reality. "No, that is impossible. I am the heir. I have my trust fund. I have my shares. You told me I was set for life." "You have absolutely nothing," Richard snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "The only reason Cassidy's firm did not liquidate our assets and sell us for parts 6 months ago was because of this marriage arrangement. The prenuptial agreement was the single legal shield protecting our entire empire. It guaranteed that as long as the marriage remained intact and free of public scandal, her firm would restructure our debt and keep us afloat." Richard finally released Declan's collar, letting his son slump weakly against the wall. He pointed a trembling finger at the scattered annulment papers on the marble floor. "By publicly admitting to infidelity on that altar," Richard hissed, "and by claiming illegitimate heirs in front of the press and our investors, you breached the morality clause. You handed her the legal right to call in all of our debt immediately. That piece of paper you laughed at, it was an execution order. She just legally authorized a hostile takeover of Price Holdings, and you signed your own death warrant." Declan slid slowly down the wall, his expensive tuxedo crumpling as he hit the floor. The fake tan seemed to wash away, leaving him looking pale and sickly. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had not outsmarted a bitter bride. He had played directly into the hands of an apex predator who had orchestrated his downfall flawlessly. Brianna looked at Declan, her eyes wide with mounting panic. "Declan, what does he mean we have nothing? We just moved in here. We have the babies. We are supposed to be billionaires." "Shut up!" Declan snapped, his voice trembling with fear and sudden violent rage. He looked up at his father, pleading for a lifeline that no longer existed. "Dad, we can fix this. We can call our lawyers. Andre can find a loophole." "Andre works for her now," Richard said, his voice completely hollow, echoing with the finality of a graveyard. "He warned me this morning that if you stepped out of line, he would pivot his allegiance immediately. They set a trap, and you walked right into it, dragging our entire legacy down with you." Declan scrambled backward against the imported silk wallpaper, his breathing growing increasingly ragged. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. He raised his hands, shaking his head so violently that a bead of sweat flung from his forehead onto the pristine marble floor. "There has to be a way out of this," Declan stammered, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own monumental failure. "We can countersue. We can claim I signed the annulment under severe emotional duress. We can tie her up in litigation for the next decade. I am a price. We do not just surrender to this kind of blatant corporate extortion." Richard let out a dark, humorless laugh. He paced across the grand foyer, his polished dress shoes crunching over the shards of the shattered porcelain vase. "You still do not understand the magnitude of your own stupidity, do you? You think you can just hire a high-priced divorce lawyer to yell at a judge and make this go away?" The patriarch stopped pacing and turned to glare at the pathetic, trembling man cowering on the floor. "This was never about a marriage," Richard spat out, his eyes burning with intense, unadulterated fury. "This was a highly orchestrated corporate acquisition. The prenuptial agreement you barely skimmed before signing was actually a fully integrated merger contract. Cassidy designed it herself. She embedded the morality clause directly into the covenants governing our corporate debt restructuring." Brianna took a tentative step forward, gripping the twins' stroller. "But he only kissed me," she whimpered, her fake victim persona crumbling into genuine terror. "We just wanted to be together. She cannot steal a whole company just because her feelings got hurt at the altar." Richard whipped his head around, fixing Brianna with a stare so venomous she shrank back. "Her feelings were not hurt, you parasite. She felt absolutely nothing. She needed a public spectacle to validate the breach of contract. By dragging your illegitimate children down that aisle and announcing his infidelity, you gave her the exact public humiliation required to activate the default protocol." Richard turned his wrath back to his son. "The moment you put your signature in red ink on that annulment filing, you officially triggered the default. That single stroke of a pen completely invalidated the standstill agreement protecting our assets. You explicitly admitted fault on the record. You waived your right to any arbitration. You gave her firm the immediate legal authority to execute a hostile takeover." Declan looked down at his trembling hands, staring at the fingers that had arrogantly signed away his existence. He had wanted to humiliate the brilliant woman who always made him feel inferior. Instead, he had handed her the ultimate weapon. "She is going to seize everything," Richard continued. "Her firm is already filing the injunctions. They will freeze our operational accounts, seize the commercial real estate portfolios, and the offshore holding companies. They are going to strip this conglomerate down to the studs and liquidate the bones to satisfy the outstanding toxic debt you just defaulted on." My stepmother collapsed onto a velvet bench, clutching her chest. Her dreams of hosting lavish charity galas and ordering custom drapes evaporated into thin air. She looked at Brianna with sheer horror, realizing her daughter had not secured a billionaire ticket, but had anchored herself to a sinking ship. "Dad, please." Declan begged, tears of pure panic welling in his eyes. "You have to call the board of directors right now. We can leverage our remaining cash reserves to buy back the debt. I will do anything. I will get on my knees and beg her to reverse the filing immediately." Richard walked slowly over to his son, his face a cold mask of absolute contempt. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving growl. "There are no cash reserves left to leverage. The board of directors is already preparing to oust me to save themselves from the fallout. You cannot beg a shark to unbite you once there is blood in the water. You chose to parade your mistress at a highly publicized corporate event. You chose to mock the most dangerous woman on Wall Street. You just handed her my billion-dollar empire on a silver platter, you idiot." The words hung heavily in the dead silent air of the grand foyer. Declan stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality unfolding before his eyes. He had thrown away a massive kingdom for a fleeting moment of petty revenge, and now he was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own monumental hubris. He realized he was utterly defenseless. Brianna stood paralyzed beside the luxury twin stroller. Her eyes darted from Richard to Declan, searching for any sign that this was just an elaborate prank. Her carefully manicured nails dug into the leather handles of the stroller as her mind raced to process the catastrophic shift in her reality. She had spent the last 9 months enduring rigorous fertility treatments, plotting and manipulating her way into this family. She had tolerated Declan's insufferable arrogance because it came with a limitless black card and a Southampton estate. Now the patriarch was declaring them completely bankrupt. Before Brianna could utter a single word of protest, a sharp, incessant vibration echoed through the silent foyer. It was coming from the inner pocket of Declan's ruined tuxedo jacket. The buzzing was frantic, a rapid-fire sequence of notifications that sounded like a ticking time bomb. Declan scrambled to pull his smartphone from his pocket. His trembling thumbs fumbled with the screen. As the display illuminated, the color drained even further from his face. The screen was flooded with high-priority alerts from his private wealth management applications. American Express Centurion card declined. Chase J.P. Morgan Reserve declined. His Platinum Concierge service messaged to alert him that the standing reservation for his private jet charter to Monaco had been cancelled due to insufficient funds. The automated payments for his penthouses, his country club memberships, and his private security details were all failing in real time. Declan frantically tapped the screen, trying to log directly into his offshore banking application. A red error message flashed across the digital display. Account suspended pending legal review. He tried his domestic accounts. Locked. He tried his emergency cryptocurrency wallets. Inaccessible. "What is happening?" Declan muttered, tapping the glass screen so hard it threatened to crack. "None of my passwords are working. Everything is flashing red." Brianna took a hesitant step forward, her voice pitching into a panicked whine. "Declan, what do you mean everything is flashing red? We need to hire security. We need to book a hotel if your father is kicking us out. Just use the black card right now." "There is no black card!" Declan screamed, shoving the phone in her face. The screen displayed a cascade of zero balances and fraud prevention lockouts. "Do you not understand English?" Brianna Cassidy froze my accounts. "I do not have a single dollar to my name." Just as the sheer horror of their destitution set in, the phone vibrated violently in Declan's hand again. An incoming call lit up the display. The caller ID showed Andre. Declan swiped to answer, his thumb hitting the speakerphone button in his panic. "Andre, thank God," Declan pleaded, his voice cracking. "You have to fix this. My accounts are locked. My cards are declining. Tell me there is a glitch at the bank." A smooth, cheerful chuckle resonated from the phone speaker. It was the sound of a man thoroughly enjoying a flawless victory. "Good afternoon, Declan," Andre greeted casually, his deep voice filling the marble foyer. "I am calling strictly in my capacity as senior counsel for the entity formerly known as Price Holdings. I wanted to extend my personal congratulations on your spectacular performance at the altar today. It was truly a masterclass in self-destruction." "Stop joking around," Declan begged, falling to his knees on the marble floor. "Andre, please, how do I unlock my trust fund?" "You do not," Andre replied cheerfully. "At precisely the moment you signed that annulment and publicly claimed those children, my team filed a series of emergency injunctions with the federal bankruptcy court. The judge was highly motivated by the mountain of evidence Cassidy provided regarding your breach of contract. A court order has officially frozen your trust fund, your stock portfolios, and every liquid asset attached to your social security number." Declan let out a guttural sob. Brianna covered her mouth, her eyes widening in sheer terror. My stepmother sank deeper into the velvet bench, grasping her chest, as she realized her daughter had successfully trapped a penniless loser. "Oh, and one more minor administrative detail," Andre continued, his tone light and conversational. "Since you utilized company collateral to purchase that custom Bugatti Chiron last month, it is now the property of Cassidy's firm. We just had the towing company impound it from the venue parking lot. I must say, the tow truck driver was very careful not to scratch the paint. Cassidy plans to auction it off and donate the proceeds to a charity that supports single mothers." "You cannot take my car!" Declan whined, sounding exactly like a spoiled toddler throwing a tantrum. "It is in my name." "Not anymore," Andre corrected smoothly. Have a pleasant afternoon, Declan. I suggest you learn how to navigate the public transit system. The subway is highly efficient this time of year. The line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Declan dropped the useless smartphone onto the floor. He curled his knees to his chest, sobbing uncontrollably into his hands. The illusion of his billionaire invincibility had been entirely dismantled in less than an hour. Brianna looked down at the weeping, broken man she had sacrificed her entire reputation to secure. She had alienated her stepsister, ruined a multi-million-dollar wedding, and humiliated herself on a massive public stage. She had done it all for yachts, diamonds, and limitless luxury. Instead, she stared at the stark reality of her future. She was now legally bound to a financially ruined, unemployable man-child, holding a twin stroller with zero financial support to fall back on. The trap she so carefully set had snapped shut, but she was the one caught inside it. Section 11. 800 words. The trap she so carefully set had snapped shut, but she was the one caught inside it. Panic is a powerful motivator. Stripped of the billionaire lifestyle, Brianna spiraled into desperation. Within 2 days of being escorted off the Southampton estate, she and my stepmother realized that crying in a motel room would not pay their bills. They needed a new strategy to extract cash from this disaster. They needed public sympathy. Leveraging the massive media spectacle from the wedding, they secured an exclusive interview on America's highest-rated morning talk show. Unable to win a legal battle against my corporate attorneys, they waged a war in the court of public opinion. They intended to paint me as a monster. I sat in my corner office, sipping black espresso while watching their live broadcast on the flat screen mounted on my wall. Andre sat across from me, a legal pad resting on his lap. We watched the performance unfold with clinical detachment. The host, known for tear-jerking interviews, leaned forward with profound sympathy. Sitting opposite her were Brianna and my stepmother. They had abandoned their designer gowns and heavy makeup. Brianna wore a plain beige sweater, her hair in a messy bun to emphasize vulnerability. My stepmother wore a modest blouse, clasping her hands nervously. Brianna held the twin boys against her chest. She had deliberately dressed the newborns in slightly worn onesies, entirely abandoning her luxury aesthetic. It was a masterclass in visual manipulation. The host asked how they were coping. Right on cue, Brianna let out a choked sob. She buried her face in the baby's blankets, shaking her head, as if the trauma was simply too much to bear. It has been a complete nightmare. Brianna wept, staring directly into the camera lens. Declan and I made a mistake by falling in love. We just wanted to be honest before she tied herself to a man who truly loved someone else. But I never imagined she would respond with such cruelty. My stepmother rubbed Brianna's shoulder protectively. She looked at the host, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Cassidy has always been a cold, calculating woman. She only cares about corporate acquisitions and profit margins. When she found out about the babies, she did not just break off the engagement. She activated a hidden legal loophole in a financial contract just to completely destroy the man she claimed to love. The host gasped, clutching her script. "You are saying she used her financial power to bankrupt him, purely out of spite?" Brianna nodded, frantically squeezing the twins closer. "She took everything from us. She seized Declan Carr, froze his bank accounts, and had us thrown out of the family home. We are currently living in a dingy motel room. I do not even have enough money to buy premium formula for my sons. She is punishing 2 innocent newborn babies just because she is jealous." "Jealous of what exactly?" the host asked softly, leaning in for the dramatic scoop. My stepmother leaned closer to the microphone. "Cassidy is barren. She cannot have children of her own. She has always resented Brianna for being fertile, for being warm, for being a natural mother. Cassidy is a corporate shark with an empty life, and she is using her billions to throw 2 innocent babies out onto the cold streets of New York purely out of spite. She wants us to starve because she cannot stand to see my daughter experience the joy of motherhood." I watched the screen without flinching. The sheer audacity of the lie was almost impressive. I was not barren. I simply had zero interest in having children, choosing instead to focus entirely on building my financial empire. They knew this perfectly well. but they also knew that the American public loved a tragic story about a wicked, childless corporate witch bullying a poor, defenseless young mother. The audience in the studio murmured in outrage. Social media metrics tracking at the bottom of the screen showed a massive spike in engagement. The hashtag demanding justice for Brianna began trending on national platforms within minutes. People who knew nothing about corporate law or hostile takeovers were blindly absorbing every word of their toxic narrative. They wanted to rally behind the weeping mother and vilify the rich corporate executive. Andre muted the television, picking up his silver pen. Well, he stated calmly, writing down a final note that was certainly a highly creative piece of fiction. Shall we proceed with the counterattack? I smiled, turning away from the screen. Let them enjoy the spotlight for just a few more hours. I want them comfortable and untouchable. Soon enough they will realize provoking me ensures a far more brutal execution in front of everyone. Soon enough they will realize provoking me ensures a far more brutal execution in front of everyone. My office desk phone began to ring. It was the direct line screened by my executive assistant. She buzzed in through the intercom, stating that my biological father was on line 1 and practically hyperventilating. I pressed the flashing speaker button. He sounded terrified, his voice a pathetic quiver reminding me exactly why my stepmother had walked all over him for decades. For 20 years I watched him fold under the slightest pressure. Now he was calling to demand I surrender my ultimate victory to spare his fragile social standing. Cassidy, please, he begged, not even bothering to say hello. You have to stop this immediately. You have to drop the takeover. The whole country is watching us on television right now. Our family is becoming a national joke. You are humiliating us. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair. Our family? I asked smoothly. You mean the woman who just went on national television to call me a barren witch, or the stepsister who tried to hijack a billionaire empire on my wedding day? He stammered, reading from a script my stepmother shoved into his trembling hands. They are emotional right now. Brianna is a new mother. She is scared, Cassidy. You are destroying a legacy over a simple misunderstanding. Just reverse the injunctions. Save the family face before this gets worse. Save the family face, I repeated, letting the words hang in the cold air. You sat in the second row of my wedding and watched a man humiliate me. You watched your stepdaughter try to steal my future. You did absolutely nothing to protect me. Cassidy, I am your father, he pleaded weakly, his voice cracking. No, you are a spectator, I stated with absolute finality. And right now you are watching the season finale. Do not call this number again. I pressed the disconnect button, cutting off his frantic apologies. I looked up at Andre. He had gathered the legal briefs into a sleek briefcase. We did not need to play the victim card on daytime television. Daytime television ran on emotion, but Wall Street ran on numbers. The suburban viewers watching Brianna cry could not impact the stock price of a multinational conglomerate. Institutional investors could. Those were the people I intended to speak to today. We bypassed the gossip reporters completely. Andre sent an exclusive press release strictly to credentialed financial journalists, market analysts, and corporate litigators. We booked the Grand Press Auditorium right in the middle of the financial district. My driver dropped us off at the imposing stone columns of the building. The autumn air was crisp, matching the sheer ice running through my veins. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit sharp enough to cut glass. Andre walked beside me, projecting the absolute authority of a man holding a royal flush. We walked into the auditorium. The flash of cameras was blinding, but the atmosphere was vastly different from the paparazzi circus at the wedding. These were men and women who cared about market fluctuations, shareholder equity, and toxic debt. They did not care about romance or broken hearts. They cared about money and liability. I stepped up to the polished wooden podium, adjusting the microphones. The large room fell into an immediate, highly respectful silence. Good morning, I began, my voice echoing clearly off the marble walls. Over the past 24 hours, there has been significant media speculation regarding the financial health of Price Holdings and the execution of a hostile takeover by my firm. I am not here to discuss daytime television gossip. I am here to address market stability, fiduciary duty, and corporate fraud. The journalists leaned forward collectively, their pens hovering over their notepads. Price Holdings has been secretly insolvent for half a decade, I stated with ruthless clarity. Their leadership attempted to conceal toxic assets behind the facade of a corporate marriage. When former heir Declan Price publicly breached the morality covenants of our restructuring agreement, he triggered an automatic legal default. My firm did not steal an empire. We foreclosed on a bad investment. I paused, making direct eye contact with the lead reporter for a major financial publication. However, the public claims made this morning by Brianna suggest that my actions were driven by personal jealousy. They claim to be innocent victims facing cruelty. Andre stepped forward, placing a heavy black folder squarely on the podium. In the cold world of high finance, we absolutely do not deal in feelings, I declared, my voice dropping down to a dangerous volume. We only deal in facts. And the undeniable facts regarding this supposedly innocent young mother are now about to become a matter of public record. And the undeniable facts regarding this supposedly innocent young mother are now about to become a matter of public record. Andre tapped a button on his presentation remote. The massive digital screen behind us flickered to life. It did not display financial charts or corporate restructuring plans. It displayed high-definition time-stamped security footage from the exclusive cocktail lounge of the St. Regis Hotel, dated exactly 10 months ago. The reporters in the auditorium instantly stopped whispering. The only sound was the rapid clicking of camera shutters. On the screen, the footage showed Declan Price sitting at a secluded corner booth looking heavily intoxicated. Brianna sat next to him. She was leaning in close, her hand resting casually on his thigh. But the focus of the footage was not the physical contact. The camera angle provided a crystal-clear view of Brianna's hands as Declan turned his head to signal a waiter. Andre narrated the silent footage with surgical precision. This video, obtained through a legal subpoena during our internal audit of Declan Price's personal liabilities, shows Brianna slipping a crushed, unidentified substance into Declan's bourbon. The auditorium erupted. Journalists scrambled to record the screen with their smartphones. On the video, Brianna smoothly dropped the powder into the amber liquid, swirling it with her finger before Declan turned back around. She then lifted the glass to his lips, encouraging him to drink. He downed it in one gulp. Minutes later, the footage showed Declan slumping forward, completely incapacitated. Brianna then signaled for the bill, draped his heavy arm over her shoulder, and guided his nearly unconscious body toward the hotel elevators. Brianna went on national television this morning to claim she and Declan made a mistake by falling in love. Andre stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. The footage you are watching is not a love story. It is premeditated, non-consensual incapacitation. It is a predatory act designed to secure a billionaire target. But we did not stop at a single video. I had Andre dig deeper. When you find a parasite feeding on a host, you usually find a history of infection. Andre opened the heavy black folder on the podium. He signaled to my legal team standing at the edges of the auditorium. They immediately began distributing thick-bound dossiers to every financial journalist in the room. What you are holding in your hands, Andre continued, is the documented extortion history of Brianna. While she plays the heartbroken mother on daytime talk shows, her financial records tell a much more lucrative story. The reporters flipped frantically through the pages. The dossiers contained heavily redacted legal settlements, bank transfer records, and sworn affidavits. Over the past 4 years, Brianna has successfully executed this exact surprise pregnancy scam on 3 separate wealthy targets. Andre revealed, pacing across the stage. 2 venture capitalists and 1 professional athlete. In each instance, she claimed an accidental pregnancy. In each instance, she threatened public exposure and severe reputation damage. And in each instance, she accepted quiet multi-million-dollar payouts in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements and agreeing to terminate the pregnancies. The room buzzed with chaotic energy. The narrative of the poor bullied single mother had just been utterly incinerated. Declan Price was not her true love, I interjected, stepping back up to the microphone. He was simply target number 4. But unlike her previous victims, Declan was foolish enough to believe he had actually outsmarted me. He believed her lies so deeply that he was willing to sacrifice his entire corporate empire to play the hero. He thought he was saving a damsel in distress. In reality, he invited a serial extortionist into the heart of his family's legacy. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished wood of the podium. My firm did not bankrupt Price Holdings out of jealousy. We enacted a necessary financial foreclosure because the heir apparent proved himself to be a catastrophic liability. We are protecting shareholder value from a man who handed over the keys to the kingdom to a professional scam artist. The press conference concluded immediately. We did not take questions. We did not need to. The evidence provided was ironclad, legally verified, and absolutely devastating. We left the financial journalist to tear apart the remains of Brianna's fabricated sob story. As Andre and I walked out of the auditorium and stepped back into our waiting SUV, I knew the immediate consequences of this revelation would be swift and entirely unforgiving. The daytime television audience would be horrified, but the elite social circles of New York would be absolutely merciless. Brianna and my stepmother were about to learn what happens when you attempt to con the very people who write the rules. The aftermath of the Wall Street press conference was instantaneous and absolute. In the digital age, a scandal of this magnitude does not just trickle into the public consciousness, it explodes. Within 30 minutes of Andre projecting the security footage and distributing the extortion dossiers, the narrative completely inverted. The very same social media platforms that had been demanding justice for Brianna earlier that morning were now tearing her to shreds. The hashtag that had briefly trended in her favor was hijacked, flooded with screen grabs of the hotel security footage showing her slipping the powder into Declan's drink. The public outrage was palpable. People who had sent sympathetic messages to her social media accounts were now demanding criminal investigations. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict, and it was entirely merciless. The morning talk show, desperate to salvage its own reputation, issued a frantic televised apology less than 2 hours later. The host, looking visibly shaken, addressed the camera to retract their entire segment. She stated that the network had been deliberately misled by Brianna and her mother, and announced that their legal department was reviewing the situation. They effectively threw Brianna and my stepmother to the wolves, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout as quickly as possible. But the social media backlash was merely background noise compared to the absolute devastation occurring in the financial markets. Price Holdings, already teetering on the edge of insolvency, went into freefall. Institutional investors, terrified by the sudden and brutal exposure of the conglomerate's toxic debt and the sheer incompetence of its former heir, began dumping their shares en masse. The stock ticker on the exchange floor looked like a countdown to an explosion. Every time the numbers refreshed, millions of dollars in corporate valuations simply vanished. The board of directors, attempting to save whatever scraps remained, convened an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to officially strip Declan of all titles, board seats, and future claims to the company. They publicly disavowed him issuing a statement that separated his catastrophic personal choices from the corporate entity. It was a futile gesture akin to rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship, but it cemented Declan's absolute excommunication from the only world he had ever known. While the financial empire crumbled, the social empire of my stepmother was experiencing an equally brutal demolition. She had spent 2 decades meticulously climbing the social ladder, leveraging my biological father's modest wealth and her own aggressive networking to secure her position among New York's elite. She had fought tooth and nail for memberships at the most exclusive country clubs, securing invitations to the most prestigious charity galas. She believed she had finally reached the pinnacle by aligning her daughter with the Price family. Instead, she became a complete pariah overnight. The elite social circles of New York are notoriously insular and unforgiving. They tolerate many things, but they do not tolerate public, messy humiliation, and they certainly do not tolerate associating with exposed extortionists. My stepmother's cell phone, which usually buzzed constantly with lunch invitations and gala committee updates, went completely silent. When she attempted to call her closest socialite friends for support, she found her number had been universally blocked. The women she had sipped champagne with just days ago were now actively scrubbing any photos of her from their social media profiles. The final blow to her social standing came via a courier delivery to the dingy motel room where she and Brianna were currently hiding. It was a formal letter from the board of directors of her primary country club. The letter bluntly stated that her membership had been revoked, effective immediately, citing conduct unbecoming of the institution's standards. There was no appeal process. She was permanently blacklisted. She sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, clutching the heavy cardstock letter while Brianna paced the small room, frantically refreshing the disastrous news alerts on her phone. The reality of their situation was settling in. They had aimed for the absolute top, attempting to steal a billionaire legacy through manipulation and deceit. Now they were stripped of their wealth, their reputation, and their social standing. They were trapped in a cheap room listening to the muffled sounds of traffic outside, realizing that the empire they tried to steal had collapsed and I had been the one to pull the final pillar down. They were trapped in a cheap room listening to the muffled sounds of traffic outside, realizing that the empire they tried to steal had collapsed, and I had been the one to pull the final pillar down. 48 hours after the press conference, the internal communication system in my sprawling Manhattan penthouse chimed. My private security detail stationed in the lobby of the high-rise informed me that Richard Price was standing at the front desk. He had bypassed my corporate office entirely, showing up at my personal residence without an appointment. He was demanding an audience. My security chief asked if I wanted him escorted off the premises by local law enforcement. I took a sip of my dark roast coffee, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling New York City skyline. I told my security team to send him up to the penthouse. I wanted to see the defeated patriarch with my own eyes. The private elevator doors slid open with a soft, metallic ping. Richard stepped onto the polished hardwood floor of my foyer. The man who had terrorized boardrooms for 4 decades looked completely unrecognizable. His custom-tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, emphasizing the sudden drastic weight loss brought on by extreme stress. His posture, usually rigid with absolute authority, was completely slouched. The deep lines on his face made him look 10 years older than he had at the wedding. He did not possess an ounce of his usual arrogance. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. I remained seated on my white leather sofa, my posture relaxed, but completely guarded. I did not offer him a drink. I did not offer him a seat. I simply waited for him to speak. Richard walked slowly toward the center of the living room. His hands were shaking violently as he reached inside his breast pocket. He pulled out a heavy leather-bound envelope and tossed it onto the glass coffee table between us. A loud clatter of metal accompanied the drop. 2 sets of heavy silver keys spilled out onto the glass alongside a stack of notarized property deeds. Those are the keys to the super yachts moored in Monaco and the Caribbean, Richard said, his voice raspy and stripped of all its former power. The deeds are for the overseas estates, the chateau in the south of France, the compound in St. Bart's, the ski lodge in the Swiss Alps. They are all completely unencumbered by the corporate debt. They are in my personal name. I am signing them all over to you right now. I glanced down at the keys and the papers, then brought my eyes back up to meet his defeated gaze. I did not say a word. The silence in the penthouse was thick and suffocating. Richard took a ragged breath. His knees suddenly buckled. The billionaire titan of industry, a man who had mercilessly crushed thousands of competitors and employees to build his massive empire, physically collapsed onto the floor. He dropped to his knees right in front of my coffee table. His hands gripped the edge of the glass surface as he looked up at me with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "Take it all," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "Take the yachts, take the estates, take complete, unquestioned control of the board. I will step down today. I will sign whatever proxy agreements you demand. I will give you absolute operational authority over every single subsidiary in the portfolio. Just cancel the debt call. Withdraw the hostile takeover filings. Please, Cassidy." I stared down at him. It was a fascinating psychological study. He was willing to sacrifice every luxury he had hoarded simply to preserve the hollow shell of his corporate legacy. "You want me to halt the liquidation," I stated calmly, clarifying his desperate proposition. "I am begging you for mercy," Richard cried out, tears actually pooling in the corners of his bloodshot eyes. "I spent 40 years building Price Holdings from the ground up. I sacrificed my youth, my marriage, and my sanity to build a legacy that would outlast me. I built an empire that commands respect across the globe. You cannot destroy 40 years of my blood and sweat just because my son is an arrogant, incompetent idiot. I am handing you the entire kingdom. Just let the Price name survive. Do not wipe my legacy off the face of the earth." He was grasping at straws, trying to appeal to a sense of professional courtesy that he had never extended to anyone else in his entire career. He thought throwing his own son under the bus would appease me. He thought surrendering his personal wealth would be enough to buy my leniency. He believed that underneath my corporate armor, I possessed some shred of mercy that he could exploit to keep his name written on the sides of office buildings. He failed to understand that mercy is a currency I stopped trading in a long time ago. He thought he could appeal to a shred of mercy that simply did not exist. I set my espresso cup down on the glass coffee table, the ceramic clinking softly against the scattered keys of his Mediterranean estates. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and looked directly into the eyes of the man who had spent 4 decades terrorizing Wall Street. "Mercy is a luxury afforded to those who make honest mistakes," Richard Defry stated quietly. "You did not make a mistake. You engineered a predatory corporate merger, disguised as a marriage, utilizing my biological father's cowardice and my stepmother's boundless greed to trap me. You raised a son who believed he was entitled to humiliate me on a public stage simply because he carried your last name. You taught Declan that wealth excuses accountability. You taught him to step on people to get what he wants." I picked up the heavy black folder sitting beside me on the sofa. It was the same dossier Andre had compiled, detailing the extensive, systematic fraud occurring within Price Holdings over the last 5 years. I tossed it onto the glass table. It landed heavily, covering the keys to the yachts he had just desperately offered me. Now I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "Teach him how to survive at the bottom of the food chain." Richard stared at this black folder, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He knew exactly what it contained. It was the undeniable proof that his entire empire was built on a foundation of sand leverage and deceit. The realization finally seemed to break through his desperate delusions. He was not negotiating a settlement. He was attending his own corporate funeral. "Cassidy, please!" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You are destroying my entire life's work. You are leaving us with absolutely nothing. My wife will not survive this kind of public humiliation. Declan does not even know how to pump his own gas. You are killing us." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. "You are dramatic, Richard. I am not killing you. I am simply foreclosing on a bad investment. Your son activated the default clause. I am just collecting what is legally owed to my firm. You gambled your legacy on Declan's ability to behave like a rational adult for 6 months, and he failed spectacularly. Take responsibility for the monster you created." I pressed the intercom button on my desk. "Security, please escort Mr. Price off the premises. He is no longer welcome in this building." Richard slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his movements stiff and heavy with sudden age. He looked at the keys and property deeds still lying on my coffee table. He reached out a trembling hand, perhaps hoping I would reconsider, perhaps hoping I would at least accept his personal bribe to save his corporate name. "Leave them," I commanded sharply. "The court-appointed receivers will need to liquidate those properties to satisfy the outstanding margin calls on your commercial real estate portfolio. They belong to my firm now." 2 heavily built private security guards stepped out of the private elevator. They did not say a word. They simply flanked Richard, their presence a silent, undeniable threat. The defeated patriarch looked at me one last time, his eyes hollow and completely devoid of the arrogant spark that had defined his entire existence. He turned and walked into the elevator, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. The stainless steel doors slid shut, sealing the fate of the Price family dynasty forever. The takeover was finalized that very afternoon. My legal team executed the hostile acquisition flawlessly. The operational accounts of Price Holdings were frozen, seized, and immediately transferred under the control of my firm's receivership division. We locked the board of directors out of their own executive suites. We seized the corporate jets, the commercial real estate portfolios, and the offshore holding companies. By the time the closing bell rang on Wall Street, Price Holdings practically ceased to exist as an independent entity. It was completely consumed, swallowed whole by the very woman Declan Price thought he had humiliated. The speed and brutality of the acquisition sent shockwaves through the financial sector. The media narrative shifted from a sensationalized wedding scandal to a masterclass in corporate warfare. My firm's valuation skyrocketed as investors realized I had successfully acquired billions in assets for pennies on the dollar, all by leveraging a broken prenuptial agreement. I had not just survived a public humiliation, I had monetized it. While I reviewed the finalized acquisition documents in my office, sipping a fresh espresso, I felt a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. The game was over. The board was cleared. The king had fallen, and the queen had taken the entire kingdom. But even as the corporate dust settled, the personal fallout was just beginning to manifest in the ugly, desperate corners where Declan and Brianna were now forced to reside. The financial execution was complete, but the internal collapse of their toxic union was about to provide a spectacular, entirely unscripted encore. The financial execution was complete, but the internal collapse of their toxic union was about to provide a spectacular, entirely unscripted encore. By sunset, the sprawling Southampton estate swarmed with federal receivers and private security contractors hired by my firm. They moved with absolute efficiency, changing the locks on the heavy mahogany doors and inventorying every piece of imported art. Declan and Brianna were given exactly 15 minutes to gather personal belongings. Since all luxury luggage had been purchased using company credit, they were forced to pack their clothes into black plastic garbage bags provided by the foreclosure agents. My stepmother had already fled the scene in a panic, hitching a ride with a bewildered caterer to avoid being photographed by the paparazzi swarming the front gates. She abandoned her daughter the moment the billionaire dream evaporated. Declan and Brianna were forced to walk past the flashing cameras holding trash bags and pushing a twin stroller. They hailed a standard yellow cab because the rideshare applications linked to Declan's frozen accounts were entirely locked. Their destination was a rundown, neon-lit motel situated just off the interstate, miles away from the manicured lawns of the Hamptons. The contrast was physically jarring. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The receptionist, chewing gum and refusing to look up from her phone, demanded cash up front for the night. Declan had to empty his wallet of the few wrinkled $100 bills he carried for valet tips just to secure a room on the ground floor. The room was cramped, dimly lit, and stained with years of neglect. The floral bedspread was frayed, and the harsh buzzing of the ancient air conditioning unit rattled the thin windows. Brianna parked the twin stroller near the scuffed television stand. The two infants, sensing the chaotic shift in their environment, began to cry loudly. Brianna did not reach down to comfort them. Instead, she stared blankly at the peeling wallpaper, the sheer magnitude of her failure crashing down upon her. She had spent the last year meticulously scheming, weaponizing her own body to secure a golden ticket. She had endured fertility treatments and played the perfect submissive victim, all to guarantee a life of yachts, diamonds, and limitless luxury. Now she was standing in a filthy motel room that smelled like mildew, trapped with a man who could not even afford to buy premium baby formula. Declan dropped his garbage bags onto the stained carpet. He paced the narrow space between the bed and the window like a caged animal. The custom tuxedo he had worn to humiliate me was now wrinkled and stained with sweat. He grabbed a cheap plastic cup from the bathroom, filled it with tap water, and slammed it down on the dresser. "Make them stop crying," Declan snapped, glaring at the stroller. "My head is splitting open." Brianna whipped her head around, her fabricated sweet demeanor vanishing instantly. She dropped the submissive act. Her eyes narrowed into hard, venomous slits. "You make them stop." Brianna spat back, her voice raising over the wails of the infants. "They are your children, Declan. Or did you forget how to be a man the second your father's credit cards got declined?" Declan scoffed, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You did this to us. If you had just stayed quiet and waited for the divorce, I could have negotiated a settlement. But no, you had to make a grand entrance. You had to have your dramatic television moment at the altar. You completely ruined my life." "You ruined your own life, you arrogant fool," Brianna screamed, stepping directly into his face. "You told me you were untouchable. You told me you were the undisputed heir to $1 billion empire. You swaggered around the Hamptons acting like a king, and you did not even know that a woman half your size owned the entire deed to your castle. You are pathetic." Declan's face flushed crimson. He kicked one of the garbage bags across the room, sending designer shirts spilling onto the dirty floor. "I gave up everything for you. I gave up my reputation, my wealth, and my entire family legacy because I thought you actually loved me." "Loved you?" Brianna laughed, a cold, harsh sound that held zero affection. "I loved the Price Holdings bank accounts, Declan. I loved the Southampton estate. I loved the private jets. Do you honestly think I would have looked twice at a spoiled, incompetent man-child if he did not have a billionaire father paying his bills? You cannot even book a hotel room without an assistant. You are entirely useless." The toxic foundation of their union was completely exposed. Without the padding of generational wealth, there was no romance, no loyalty, and absolutely no love. They were just two greedy parasites who had tried to feed off the same host, only to realize they had drained each other dry. Declan sank onto the sagging motel bed, burying his face in his hands as Brianna continued to hurl insults at him. The screaming match echoed through the thin walls of the cheap motel, a fitting soundtrack for the absolute death of their fraudulent fairy tale. Declan was broken, but a drowning man will still thrash violently before he goes under. He could not accept that he was going to live the rest of his life as a cautionary tale for the elite. He needed money, not just to survive, but to exact revenge on the woman who had stripped him of his title. The top-tier legal firms in Manhattan had already blacklisted him. No respectable corporate litigator was going to touch a client who had willingly signed an explicit admission of moral breach on a wedding altar. Declan was radioactive. Desperation drove him to the absolute bottom of the legal barrel. He hired a sleazy, aggressive attorney known for ambulance chasing and sensationalized tabloid lawsuits. The man operated out of a cramped office in Queens and wore suits that smelled faintly of cheap cigars. He did not care about corporate law or hostile takeovers. He cared about public settlements and extracting cash through sheer annoyance. The lawsuit landed on my desk 3 weeks after the acquisition was finalized. It was a chaotic, legally dubious mess of a filing, but it contained one specific angle designed to force my firm back into the courtroom. The lawsuit claimed that because Declan had publicly acknowledged the infant twins as his legitimate heirs on the day of the merger breach, those children were technically Price heirs. The sleazy lawyer argued that the corporate assets my firm seized were inextricably linked to the generational wealth meant to support those heirs. He was not suing to reverse the corporate takeover. He knew that was impossible. He was suing me for tens of millions of dollars in child support and alimony, claiming I had illegally confiscated the financial trust meant for the innocent children. It was a Hail Mary pass thrown in the dark. It was legally flimsy, relying heavily on emotion and public sympathy rather than contract law. The lawsuit was designed to be loud and messy, hoping that my firm would simply offer a massive cash settlement just to make the embarrassing public spectacle go away. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table in my newly rebranded corporate headquarters. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, looking down at the subpoena resting on the polished surface. I was completely unbothered. I did not feel a single ounce of pressure. Andre sat to my right, rapidly typing on his silver laptop. He paused, adjusting his tie, and looked at the document with a mixture of amusement and profound professional disgust. "This is garbage," Andre stated, tossing his pen onto the table. The legal precedent he is citing was overturned 12 years ago. He is trying to pierce the corporate veil using child support statutes that do not even apply to commercial debt restructuring. It is a frivolous nuisance suit. We could get a judge to throw this out by lunchtime on Tuesday. I set my coffee cup down. I do not want it thrown out, I replied, a slow, predatory smile creeping across my face. If we throw it out, Declan gets to play the victim forever. He gets to tell the world that the big bad corporate shark crushed his poor lawyer before he could present his case. We are not going to silence him, Andre. We are going to give him a megaphone. Andre raised an eyebrow, closing his laptop. You want to take this to court? You want to entertain this circus? I want to destroy his remaining illusion of control, I clarified. He brought those children into my wedding to humiliate me. Now he is trying to use them as a shield to extort me. I want the judge to hear his entire argument. I want it all on the public record. Andre nodded slowly, understanding the assignment perfectly. We will accept the subpoena. We will not file for an immediate dismissal. We will let them walk right into the courtroom thinking they actually have a chance at a settlement. For the next 2 weeks, Declan and his lawyer ramped up the media pressure. They leaked carefully edited portions of their lawsuit to the tabloids. They pushed the narrative that I was a vindictive billionaire hoarding money that rightfully belonged to innocent babies. Brianna, sensing a potential payday, played along perfectly. She posted sad filtered photos of the twins on social media, adding cryptic captions about struggling to survive while corporate giants stole their future. They were building a massive, highly publicized soap opera, completely unaware that I was controlling the stage lighting. They believed they were cornering me with public shame. I was just waiting for them to step onto the trapdoor. While they spent their days coordinating with gossip columns, Andre was utilizing the full, terrifying power of our legal division to investigate the foundational claim of their entire lawsuit. He was looking closely at the specific details surrounding the birth of the so-called Price heirs. Andre did not build his stellar reputation by accepting the opposition narrative at face value. While Declan and his sleazy attorney were busy feeding fabricated sob stories to the tabloids, Andre was executing a series of aggressive legal maneuvers. He filed targeted subpoenas, demanding the complete unredacted medical files from the luxury private hospital where Brianna had given birth to the twins. He did not care about the media circus. He only cared about the raw, undeniable data. When the heavy boxes of medical files finally arrived at our corporate headquarters, Andre locked himself in the main conference room with a double espresso and a highlighter. He spent 3 consecutive days cross-referencing every single page of Brianna prenatal care records against Declan's highly documented corporate travel itinerary. Declan was a man who lived his entire life on the company dime. Every private jet flight, every luxury hotel suite, and every expensive dinner had been meticulously logged by Price Holdings' accounting department for tax purposes. Since my firm now owned Price Holdings, we owned those expense reports too. Andre laid the medical timeline out on one side of the mahogany table, and Declan travel manifests on the other. It did not take long for his brilliant legal mind to spot the glaring catastrophic flaw in Brianna's entire extortion plot. Andre walked into my office on a Thursday morning, completely bypassing my executive assistant. He did not knock. He strode directly to my desk and dropped a compiled file right on top of my keyboard. He looked exhausted, having clearly been awake all night, but he was wearing a smile so wide and predatory that it practically illuminated the room. You found the kill shot, I stated quietly, already knowing the answer before I even touched the paperwork. Andre tapped his index finger against the cardboard cover of the file. Brianna claimed in her sworn affidavit that the twins were conceived during a very specific romantic weekend getaway at a ski lodge in Aspen. She provided the exact dates to align with the gestational age of the infants when they were born. The only problem is Declan was not in Aspen during that week. He was not even on the same continent. I leaned forward, my interest entirely captured. Where was he, I asked. He was in Tokyo. Andre replied, his deep voice thick with absolute satisfaction. He was attending an international tech conference. We have the flight manifests from the private jet, the hotel receipts from the Mandarin Oriental, and time-stamped security footage of him walking into the Tokyo Convention Center on the exact days Brianna claims they were conceiving those children in a snow-covered cabin in Colorado. The biological timeline is completely fabricated. It is physically impossible for him to be the father. I let out a soft, sharp laugh. She got greedy, I noted, picking up the file to review the flight logs myself. She needed the gestational timeline to match the size and development of the twins, but she did not bother to check his corporate calendar before she swore under penalty of perjury. It gets better. Andre continued pacing across my office. I dug deeper into her financial records from that same quarter. I found a massive, heavily redacted cash payment made to a private fertility clinic in Manhattan. She did not just get pregnant by accident. She intentionally underwent in vitro fertilization. She purchased donor material from an anonymous sperm bank to guarantee she would conceive twins, knowing that a multiple pregnancy would secure a much higher payout from whoever she managed to trap. The sheer audacity of her scheme was almost impressive. Brianna had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar fraud, destroyed a billionaire legacy, and publicly humiliated herself, all to secure child support from a man who had absolutely zero genetic connection to her children. Declan had thrown away his entire empire to play the hero for a woman who was actively conning him. "We are not waiting for the scheduled hearing next month," Andre stated, his eyes locking onto mine with fierce determination. "I am filing an emergency motion to compel a court-ordered paternity test immediately. I am going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning and demand the judge force Declan to submit a DNA sample before we proceed with a single second of this lawsuit." I closed the file and handed it back to him. "Do it," I commanded. "Let them walk into that courtroom thinking they are about to win millions. Let them stand in front of the judge and swear they are a family, and then we pull the floor right out from under them." Andre nodded, turning on his heel to head back to the legal department. The trap was fully set. The final curtain call was rapidly approaching, and Brianna had absolutely no idea that her fabricated empire was about to be incinerated by basic biology. The morning of the emergency hearing, the Manhattan courthouse was swarming with reporters. Declan and his sleazy attorney had made sure the press knew exactly when and where the showdown would take place. They wanted a public spectacle. They wanted cameras flashing as they walked into the building, playing the role of the oppressed, destitute family fighting against the cruel corporate machine. I arrived with Andre slipping through a private side entrance that my security team had arranged. We bypassed the media circus entirely and went straight to the designated courtroom. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense. The polished mahogany paneling and the high vaulted ceiling gave the room an imposing, authoritative feel. I took my seat at the defense table, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. Andre sat beside me, his black leather briefcase resting on the table. He looked perfectly calm, completely unbothered by the dramatic stakes of the hearing. Declan and Brianna entered the courtroom a few minutes later, followed by their attorney. Brianna pushed the luxury twin stroller, deliberately positioning it near the plaintiff's table, so the judge would have a clear view of the infants. She was dressed in a conservative pale blue dress, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was leaning heavily into the innocent mother persona, clutching a tissue in one hand and dabbing at her dry eyes. Declan wore a cheap suit that looked hastily purchased off the rack. He sat up straight, puffing out his chest, trying to project confidence. He shot me a venomous glare across the aisle, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperate greed. His lawyer, a man who looked like he had slept in his suit, began shuffling papers loudly, attempting to look important and prepared. The judge, a stern woman in her late 50s with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, entered the room. Everyone rose. She took her seat at the bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and opened the case file. "We are here today regarding an emergency motion filed by the defense," the judge stated, her voice echoing clearly through the courtroom. "However, I understand the plaintiffs are seeking significant financial compensation based on claims of paternity and inheritance rights." Declan's attorney stood up dramatically, adjusting his tie. "Yes, Your Honor. My client, Declan Price, is the biological father of these two innocent infants. Because he publicly acknowledged them as his heirs, they are legally entitled to a portion of the Price family corporate assets, which were unlawfully seized by the defendant Cassidy's firm. We are demanding a multi-million-dollar payout to ensure these children are not left destitute on the streets of New York. Brianna let out a soft, rehearsed sob, clutching the edge of the stroller. The judge looked at the plaintiff's table, then turned her attention to Andre. Does the defense have a response to these claims? Andre stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not look at Declan or Brianna. He focused entirely on the judge, his posture commanding absolute respect. Your Honor. Andre began, his deep voice filling the courtroom. The defense does not dispute that these infants deserve financial support. However, we vehemently dispute the foundational claim of this entire lawsuit. We dispute that Declan Price is the biological father of these children. A collective gasp echoed from the small gallery of spectators and legal clerks seated in the back of the room. Declan bolted upright, his face turning a furious shade of red. That is a lie, Declan shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Andre. She is just trying to stall. I claimed them. They are my sons. The judge slammed her gavel down sharply. Mr. Price, you will remain silent until you are recognized by this court, or I will have you removed. Declan sank back into his chair, his jaw clenched tight. Brianna looked frantically between Declan and the judge, her carefully constructed victim persona cracking at the edges. Andre continued, completely unfazed by the outburst. Your Honor, the plaintiffs have built this entire lawsuit on a timeline of conception that is biologically impossible. Brianna submitted a sworn affidavit claiming these children were conceived during a specific weekend in Aspen, Colorado. We have submitted corporate flight manifests, hotel receipts, and timestamp security footage proving definitively that Declan Price was in Tokyo, Japan during that exact week. Brianna's face went completely slack. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sickly pale. She stared at Andre, sheer terror replacing her manufactured grief. Furthermore, Andre stated, picking up a folder from the defense table, we have subpoenaed financial records showing that during that same quarter, Brianna made a substantial cash payment to a private fertility clinic in Manhattan. We have reason to believe she underwent in vitro fertilization using anonymous donor material to guarantee a multiple pregnancy. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Declan slowly turned his head to look at Brianna. His arrogant expression dissolved into profound, paralyzing confusion. Your Honor, Andre concluded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Before this court entertains a single discussion regarding financial compensation or inheritance rights, we formally request an emergency court-ordered DNA test to officially establish paternity. We demand to know, without a shadow of a doubt, who the father of these children actually is. Brianna slumped forward, her hands covering her face. She knew the game was over. The trap was sprung, and there was absolutely no escape. The judge adjusted her glasses, peering down at Brianna with absolute unfiltered disgust. She slowly unsealed a manila envelope that had been resting on her desk since the start of the hearing. It bore the official seal of the state-mandated genetic testing facility. The rustling of the heavy paper seemed deafening in the dead-silent courtroom. Declan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table. His knuckles were white. He was still clinging to the delusion that this was all a massive bluff, a corporate intimidation tactic. He genuinely believed that the two infants sleeping in the luxury stroller were his flesh and blood, his ultimate leverage against me. The judge pulled out a single sheet of paper. She read the contents silently, her frown deepening. Then she looked directly at Declan. Mr. Price. The judge stated, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The results of the court-ordered paternity test are conclusive. You share a 0% genetic match with either of these infants. You are not the biological father. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. A collective audible gasp swept through the gallery of reporters and legal clerks. Declan stared at the judge, his face completely blank. His brain short-circuited, unable to process the catastrophic weight of the information. He slowly turned his head to look at Brianna. What is she talking about? Declan demanded, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. Brianna shrank back in her chair. She didn't have a snappy comeback. She didn't have a fake tear left to shed. The absolute truth had cornered her, and she was utterly defenseless. Andre stood up, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He wasn't finished. He approached the center of the courtroom holding a thick, bound dossier. Your Honor? Andre began projecting his voice so every single reporter in the back row could hear him clearly. We took the liberty of investigating why Brianna was so confident she could trap Mr. Price with a fabricated pregnancy. We discovered that 3 years ago, during a highly classified corporate scandal involving toxic chemical exposure at one of Price Holdings' manufacturing plants, Declan Price suffered permanent, irreversible sterility. Declan's head snapped toward Andre. The color drained entirely from his face. The deepest, most guarded secret of his existence, a medical reality his father had spent millions of dollars covering up to protect the family's image of masculine virility, was now being broadcast in an open courtroom. Only a handful of people in the entire world knew that medical truth. Andre continued smoothly. I knew it because I was the corporate counsel tasked with sealing the medical records. And Brianna knew it because she hacked into her mother's email account and found the non-disclosure agreements my firm drafted for the Price family. Brianna let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her hands. She knew Declan was sterile, Andre stated, delivering the final fatal blow. So she took the cash she extorted from her previous victims, walked into an elite fertility clinic in Manhattan, and purchased donor material from an anonymous sperm bank. She intentionally underwent in vitro fertilization to guarantee a multiple pregnancy. She needed twins to maximize the child support payout. She didn't want a family, Mr. Price. She wanted a paycheck, and she knew you were arrogant and desperate enough to believe you had miraculously fathered heirs. Declan collapsed back into his chair. He looked at the 2 infants sleeping peacefully in the stroller, then looked down at his own shaking hands. The sheer magnitude of his monumental stupidity finally crashed down upon him. He had stood on a wedding altar and publicly humiliated me. He had triggered a morality clause that legally forfeited his entire billion-dollar empire. He had destroyed his father's legacy, bankrupted his family, and reduced himself to a public laughingstock. He threw away castles, superyachts, and boundless wealth to take responsibility for a family that never even existed. He had traded absolute power for a meticulously orchestrated lie. You set me up! Declan screamed, leaping out of his chair and lunging toward Brianna. You ruined my entire life! The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. Court bailiffs rushed forward, tackling Declan before he could reach the weeping woman. Reporters scrambled over the wooden benches, their cameras flashing relentlessly, capturing every second of the billionaire heir's total humiliating breakdown. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, sipping a glass of ice water. I watched Declan being restrained by law enforcement, his face twisted in pure impotent rage. He was screaming that he had nothing left, that he had lost everything for a lie. He finally understood the brutal reality of the trap he had so arrogantly sprung on himself. The financial execution was complete, and the biological truth had just delivered the final undeniable death blow to the Price family dynasty. Section 22. 800 words. The financial execution was complete, and the biological truth had just delivered the final undeniable death blow to the Price family dynasty. Judge Sterling slammed her heavy wooden gavel down, the sharp sound cracking like a gunshot over the screaming gallery. She demanded absolute order, her face twisted in a mask of unprecedented judicial rage. She had never witnessed such a brazen, calculated attempt to defraud the United States legal system. Bailiffs, the judge roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at Brianna. Detain that woman immediately. Place her in custody. Brianna shrieked as 2 court officers advanced toward the plaintiff table. She scrambled backward, knocking her chair to the polished hardwood floor. Frantically, she tried to grab the luxury twin stroller to use the innocent infants as a physical shield against her impending arrest. The pathetic maneuver only further disgusted everyone watching. "You cannot arrest me," Brianna wailed, fighting wildly against the officers as they seized her arms and forcefully pulled them behind her back. "I am a mother. I am a victim. Declan promised to take care of me. You have to let me go right now." "You are a criminal," the judge corrected with lethal precision. "You committed blatant perjury by submitting a sworn affidavit containing completely fabricated biological timelines. I am holding you in direct contempt of court and formally recommending the district attorney pursue immediate felony charges for wire fraud, grand extortion, and perjury." The cold steel of handcuffs clicked sharply around Brianna's wrists, signaling the absolute end of her gold-digging career. She sobbed hysterically, expensive mascara running down her face as she was dragged down the center aisle. Declan remained slumped in his chair, completely catatonic. The press gallery went absolutely feral, camera shutters capturing the exact moment the aspiring billionaire housewife was hauled away in chains. A court-appointed social worker quietly stepped forward to take custody of the bewildered infants. While Brianna was being processed in a cold concrete holding cell downtown, an equally brutal financial reckoning was rapidly unfolding at my stepmother's suburban estate. She had foolishly believed that distancing herself from the wedding disaster would protect her carefully hoarded wealth. She was entirely mistaken. During the intense forensic audit of Price Holdings, Andre discovered a fatal vulnerability. My stepmother had taken out massive, highly leveraged personal loans using Richard Price corporate equity as her primary collateral. She had used that borrowed money to fund her extravagant lifestyle, purchasing imported sports cars, designer wardrobes, and funding her elite country club dues. When my firm triggered the corporate default and seized the Price assets, her personal loans instantly went into a catastrophic default alongside them. Without Richard Billionaire's shield to protect her, she was left entirely exposed to the merciless reality of aggressive corporate debt collection. At precisely 2 o'clock that afternoon, a fleet of unmarked black vans pulled up to her manicured driveway. They were not socialite friends arriving for a garden party. They were relentless federal asset liquidators accompanied by local law enforcement officers holding active seizure warrants. My stepmother stood on her grand front porch in her silk bathrobe, screaming in absolute horror as the repo men bypassed her completely. They marched straight through her mahogany front doors and began tagging every single piece of valuable furniture. They seized her custom Mercedes SUV from the driveway, hooking it up to a tow truck before she could even retrieve her expensive sunglasses from the dashboard. "You cannot do this to me," my stepmother shrieked, chasing a debt collector down the main hallway. "That artwork belongs to me. I have elite social standing in this town. I will sue every single one of you." The lead liquidator turned around and handed her a thick stack of foreclosure notices. "You have exactly zero social standing, ma'am," he stated coldly. "Your bank accounts are frozen by federal mandate. You have 10 minutes to vacate the premises before we change the locks." In a final, deeply humiliating blow, a female officer required my stepmother to unhook and surrender the heavy diamond necklace she was wearing, as it was listed as an asset purchased with fraudulent corporate funds. She stood on the sidewalk, shivering in her robe, clutching a single plastic garbage bag of basic clothing. She tried calling her wealthy friends for a place to stay, but every single call went straight to voicemail. The neighbors she had spent years looking down upon now stood on their lawns watching her absolute ruin with quiet satisfaction. She had spent my entire life stealing my peace to build her fragile glass castle. Now she was entirely homeless, penniless, and universally despised, watching her stolen kingdom shatter into a million worthless pieces. Section 23, 800 words. She tried calling her wealthy friends for a place to stay, but every single call went straight to voicemail. The neighbors she had spent years looking down upon now stood on their lawns, watching her absolute ruin with quiet satisfaction. She had spent my entire life stealing my peace to build her fragile glass castle. Now she was entirely homeless, penniless, and universally despised, watching her stolen kingdom shatter into a million worthless pieces. Declan's descent into madness was swift and thoroughly documented by the relentless American media. The man who had strutted down the aisle of a $2 million wedding, fully believing he had outsmarted the most dangerous woman on Wall Street, was now a hollow, broken shell of a man. The sheer psychological weight of his monumental stupidity finally crushed whatever fragile grip he had left on reality. He had forfeited a brilliant marriage. He had surrendered a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. He had destroyed his father's 40-year legacy. And he had done it all for a woman who was actively conning him, and for two infants who shared absolutely zero genetic connection to him. He was the ultimate undisputed punchline of the decade. The tabloids were merciless. Late-night talk show hosts dedicated entire monologues to his spectacular downfall. Financial analysts on national television used his name as a cautionary verb for catastrophic corporate blunders. Declan Price went from being an arrogant heir apparent to a national laughingstock in less than 48 hours. His desperation quickly morphed into unhinged paranoia. He began loitering outside my corporate headquarters, wearing the same wrinkled, stained suit he had worn on the day of the trial. He shouted at my security detail, demanding to see me, claiming that he still had legal rights to the company, that the DNA test was a conspiracy orchestrated by Andre. He ranted to anyone who would listen that he was the true victim, completely oblivious to the fact that every single person walking past him viewed him with absolute unadulterated pity. My security chief eventually had to file a restraining order, which the judge granted with zero hesitation. The former billionaire heir was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of the empire he used to own. He tried to salvage some semblance of his former life, but his toxicity was radioactive. He reached out to his old fraternity brothers, the wealthy heirs, and venture capitalists he used to drink $1,000 bottles of scotch with. They ignored his calls. When he managed to corner one of them outside an exclusive Manhattan social club, the man looked at Declan with complete disgust and told him to never contact him again. Nobody in the elite social circles wanted anything to do with a man who was stupid enough to sign away $1 billion on a wedding altar for a fake pregnancy. Unemployable, destitute, and completely isolated, Declan eventually retreated to a cheap, roach-infested motel on the outskirts of the city, surviving on the meager, quickly depleting cash reserves he had managed to hide before my firm seized his accounts. The man who once chartered private jets to Monaco now struggled to afford a hot meal. While Declan spiraled into total obscurity, the patriarch of the fallen empire faced an equally brutal reckoning. Richard Price had spent his entire life building an image of absolute terrifying power. He was a titan, a predator who crushed his enemies without a second thought. But the public humiliation of the trial, coupled with the complete and sudden liquidation of his global assets, proved to be a fatal combination. The stress of watching his 40-year legacy burn to the ground, ignited by the sheer incompetence of his only son, was too much for his heart to bear. 2 days after the explosive courtroom revelation, Richard suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. He was found collapsed in his private office, clutching a useless stack of obsolete corporate ledgers. The ambulance rushed him to a premier private hospital, but the moment the hospital administrators ran his insurance and financial information, they discovered the catastrophic truth. His accounts were completely frozen by federal injunction. His platinum health insurance policies tied to the defunct Price holdings were entirely void. The man who used to own half the commercial real estate in Manhattan could not even afford a basic private hospital room. Once he was medically stabilized, the reality of his new existence set in. Because his assets were locked in complex federal receivership, and because his family was entirely bankrupt, there was no private care available to him. The formidable Richard Price was quietly transferred from the elite private hospital to a low-income state-funded care facility on the edge of the city. The facility was clean but stark and understaffed. The walls were painted a sterile, depressing beige. The man who used to command boardrooms and dine with senators was now confined to a narrow metal-framed bed in a shared room. The stroke had left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly, trapping him inside his own failing body. He spent his days staring blankly at a small, grainy television screen watching the financial news networks discuss the incredible soaring success of my newly rebranded corporate empire. He was forced to witness the triumphant rise of the woman he had tried to exploit, entirely powerless to stop it, left with absolutely nothing but the crushing, suffocating silence of his own spectacular failure. Section 24, 800 words. 1 year later, the skyline of Manhattan glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. The autumn air was crisp, identical to the weather on the day I executed the hostile takeover that changed my life. I stood by the glass looking out over the city that now felt entirely like my own domain. On the coffee table rested the latest issue of Forbes magazine. My face was on the cover. The headline read, "The Apex Predator: How Cassidy Re-Engineered a Billion-Dollar Dynasty in 30 Days." I was no longer just a sharp investment banker. I was officially recognized as the most ruthless and brilliant M&A expert in the country. The financial world didn't just respect me, they feared me. I had dismantled a legacy built on arrogance and rebuilt it on a foundation of absolute uncompromising efficiency. My firm had entirely rebranded the former Price conglomerate. The outdated leveraged assets were liquidated or restructured. The toxic debt was cleared. We turned a sinking ship into a sleek, impenetrable dreadnought. The Price name was scrubbed from every building, every subsidiary, and every legal document. The legacy Richard had spent 40 years building was erased, replaced by an entity that answered solely to me. I turned away from the window, the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses, drawing my attention back to the room. I was hosting a massive celebration in my penthouse, but the guest list was meticulously curated. There were no fake socialites, no manipulative relatives, and certainly no parasitic heirs. This was my chosen family. Andre stood near the custom marble bar, laughing heartily as he recounted a particularly brutal deposition to a group of my senior analysts. He was no longer just an ally, he was a full partner in my firm. His sharp legal mind and unwavering loyalty had been instrumental in securing the empire, and I made sure he was compensated exactly what he was worth. Beside him stood Felicity. She had severed all ties with her father and brother the moment the truth about Brianna's scam and their corporate fraud came to light. She had refused to sink with the Price ship. Instead, she had launched her own independent tech venture entirely self-funded and was currently negotiating her first major public offering. She looked radiant, unburdened by the toxic expectations of her former family. My executive assistant, the woman who had handed me the red folder on the altar, was currently dominating a game of high-stakes poker with two of my lead negotiators in the corner lounge. The atmosphere was vibrant, filled with genuine respect and mutual success. These were people who earned their place in my life, not through blood or obligation, but through loyalty and competence. As I walked toward the bar to refresh my espresso, my personal smartphone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing at the screen. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in nearly 12 months: biological father. He hadn't called when I was featured on Forbes. He hadn't called when my firm announced record-breaking quarterly profits. He was calling now because the dust had settled, and the reality of his own financial mismanagement, stripped of my stepmother's aggressive social climbing, had likely caught up with him. He was calling because he needed money. He was calling because he thought deep down the biological tie still held some currency. I stared at the incoming call screen. A year ago, the sight of his name might have provoked a flicker of anger or a dull ache of disappointment. Now I felt absolutely nothing. The screen kept flashing, demanding attention from a woman who no longer had any to give. I didn't answer. I didn't send him to voicemail. I simply pressed the block contact button, confirming the action with a swift tap of my thumb. His number vanished into the digital void, permanently severed from my existence. He was a relic of a past I had outgrown, a spectator who had lost his front row seat. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling the final satisfying click of a closed door. I approached the bar where Andre had just finished pouring 2 fresh glasses of vintage champagne. He handed one to me, his dark eyes sparkling with shared victory. "You know," Andre said, gesturing toward the sweeping city view, I was reviewing the final quarterly reports this morning. We didn't just stabilize the assets, we doubled their valuation. It turns out that when you remove the dead weight, a company can actually fly. I took a sip of the champagne, the bubbles crisp and sharp. We didn't just remove the dead weight, Andre, we incinerated it. We built this on competence, not entitlement. Felicity joined us, raising her own glass. To competence, she agreed, her smile wide and genuine, and to the complete destruction of anyone who mistakes kindness for weakness. I clinked my crystal flute against hers, the sharp sound ringing out above the low hum of the penthouse celebration. I looked at Felicity with profound respect. She had done something remarkably brave. When the forensic financial audit exposed her father and brother's fraudulent activities, Felicity did not hesitate. She severed ties instantly and publicly. She refused to accept a single dime from the crumbling Price estate, walking away before the federal receivers even arrived. Instead, she took her brilliant mind, partnered with Andre, and launched an independent technology venture that was currently disrupting the entire market. She was the only Price who understood that true power comes from building your own foundation rather than inheriting a decaying, leveraged castle built on decades of corporate fraud and blatant family deceit. Andre wrapped a strong, protective arm around his wife's waist, looking down at her with absolute pride. We watched her family try to use their name as a weapon for years. Andre stated, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute finality. They thought they could operate above the law because they possessed a billionaire title. Look exactly where that sheer arrogance finally got them today. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the vintage liquid cool my throat. They handed us the matches and poured the gasoline themselves, I replied smoothly. We simply refused to catch fire with them. I watched their empire burn from a safe distance. The three of us stood together in the center of the sprawling penthouse, an impenetrable triad of competence, loyalty, and ruthless survival. This was the family I had consciously chosen. We were not bound by fragile genetics or manipulative guilt trips. We were united by mutual respect and the undeniable fact that we had completely dismantled a billionaire dynasty from the inside out. Around us, my hand-picked team of elite analysts and corporate litigators celebrated their massive quarterly bonuses. Every single person standing on my hardwood floors had earned their position through sheer intelligence. I had fired the nepotism hires and cleansed the corporate rot. In its place, I had cultivated an absolute meritocracy. Felicity raised her glass one more time, catching the ambient light of the Manhattan skyline, reflecting off the crystal. To healthy boundaries, she proposed loudly, her voice steady and clear over the upbeat jazz playing through the sound system. We survived the storm they created, and to the beautiful, brutal reality of justice. To brutal justice, Andre and I echoed in perfect unison, raising our glasses high. We drank to the new era. I excused myself from the bar, leaving Andre and Felicity to enjoy the celebration they had earned. I walked across the spacious living room, my heels completely silent on the luxury rugs, until I reached the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread out below me, a sprawling grid of golden lights. Far below, the financial district pulsed with aggressive energy, completely unaware of the specific surgical destruction I had orchestrated. They thought they were the apex predators, but they were just prey. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. My biological father was permanently blocked. My stepmother was utterly destitute. Brianna was sitting in a federal holding cell facing prosecution for extortion. Declan was a penniless, unemployable joke wandering the streets. Richard was trapped in a sterile state-funded bed, entirely powerless. They had all tried to consume me. They genuinely believed their sheer audacity would overwhelm my logic. They were completely and utterly wrong. The consequences of their unmitigated greed were permanent. Looking down at the glittering streets of New York, a profound, unshakable peace settled over my entire being. I felt the absolute clarity of total victory. People often misunderstand retaliation. They think it requires screaming matches or sinking to the pathetic level of the people who betrayed you. They think you have to actively tear your opponents apart with your own two hands to win the war. The truth is far more elegant. The absolute unquestionable best revenge is not destroying your enemies. That requires too much energy and emotional investment. The best revenge is recognizing a sinking ship stepping out of the way and letting their own boundless greed burn them to the ground. You just have to establish your boundaries, stand at a safe distance, pour yourself a glass of champagne, and enjoy the warmth of the roaring fire. I took one final lingering sip from my crystal flute, savoring the taste of absolute success. I turned my back on the skyline and walked back into the vibrant, thriving world I had built entirely on my own terms. I had successfully secured my empire, protected my peace, and proven that ultimate power always belongs to the one who refuses to lose their composure. The spectacular downfall of the Price dynasty illustrates a brutal but undeniable truth. Empires built on entitlement, deceit, and manipulation will inevitably collapse under their own weight. Declan and Brianna falsely believed that arrogance and scheming could outmaneuver genuine competence. In contrast, Cassidy's ultimate victory wasn't born from screaming matches or desperate pleas, but from surgical precision, unyielding emotional control, and a foundation of undeniable skill. True power doesn't come from stealing someone else's legacy. It comes from building your own unshakable meritocracy. Focus on mastering your craft and maintaining your composure, letting competence be your ultimate shield. This narrative perfectly highlights that the most effective revenge is simply removing yourself as a target and allowing toxic individuals to sabotage themselves through their own greed.